pretty excited about the topic for this. And I mean, that excitement is not from a, webinar delivery perspective. It's really about sort of the topic and the expertise we have here on the webinar. A topic that really jumped out for those of you who were able to join the last webinar on May the 8th. We had done some of the preliminary findings.
Oh, away.
For the
I'm not doing anything for you right now.
Diane, please mute and stop telling me to go away.
Oh, it's my, oh, Jesus. Sorry, Barb. That was the dog I was talking to.
Yeah,
I thought I would have entered on mute. My apologies.
Welcome. That's great. Okay. So, no, I mean, the topic of this was introduced at our last webinar, May 8th, when we did that preliminary findings from the needs assessment. And so we're really building on that. And I mean, some projects, some of you did in fact name developmental evaluation as an approach that you are currently using, want to use, and identified it as a topic to learn more about. And even if you had not named it as an area of interest, two things really stand out right now. I mean, all projects, everyone in the world is navigating uncertainty. Therefore, developmental evaluation has a place, and all projects, all of you are actually doing something developmental if you're newly launching, or if you're, adapting something that's existed for years, scaling up, there's still developmental elements. So the relevance to all of you, I mean, Jamie will get into that more fully. He will absolutely position developmental evaluation in a more fulsome way, but I just wanted to provide those brief introductory remarks on why we're doing a webinar on developmental evaluation. I will, following this slide, talk about the objectives or what we're thinking about for this webinar and introduce our speaker. We'll get a presentation by Jamie Gamble. You would have had an introduction to him actually in the very first KDE Hub monthly update. We had a little spotlight profile on Jamie, so there he was, and here he is. And then we'll have a Q&A discussion, really, talking about things that are most relevant to all of you. And then we'll have a very brisk close to the webinar. So basically what we thought about for what we want to accomplish today. And essentially, to focus on three main things, really the understanding of the purpose of developmental evaluation. What is it and how it might be relevant to your projects? Get a bit of a sense, that visual or otherwise about what does it look like if you're actually doing it and how is it done? And then to begin to consider what kinds of tools or other supports might be useful to you, because that's actually where the hub comes in as well, is to build on the webinar and potentially offer some other supports. So next, I just wanted to do a really brief introduction to Jamie Gamble before passing the baton over to him. And you've seen his bio. If you've not, I encourage you to, here's my little plug, go to the monthly update. And you'll get a brief intro on some of the things that Jamie has done that are particularly relevant to developmental evaluation. He's got a ton of experience. I mean, rich experience in DE and beyond. And I would say that, Jamie really is an international leader in this tradition of developmental evaluation. So we really are delighted he's here. Now, I actually like the fact that, and Jamie, you must know, I wasn't just going to say, and over to you. So I have to add a little personal anecdote in here. But I actually like the fact that I don't even remember, don't know the first time that I met Jamie. And why I like that is because Jamie is one of those people in my sort of world who just keeps showing up. We're on different journeys, but shared interests, meaningful connections, etc. But just that, he just keeps showing up. And like Diane said to me, go away. I'm just kidding, Jamie. So, that's intriguing to me. And And 4 ways in which he's really showed up. One, there was a national knowledge exchange forum on evaluation for learning. It was actually co-developed by and co-hosted by the Public Health Agency of Canada, the McConnell Foundation, and the Propel Center, where I used to serve as the executive director. And so those 3 organizations came together on this topic of evaluation for learning. Then Jamie showed up again to lead a case book on the same topic. Then he worked with our group to work on this international scan of systems or complexity-based approaches to knowledge exchange. And we, unsurprisingly, have hired Jamie to work with us as a developmental evaluation consultant with the hub. So, you know, I don't think there's anybody a better position to speak on the topic of developmental evaluation. And Jamie, we're grateful for you showing up today as well. So over to you.
Thank you, Barb. What an intro. Lovely to be with all of you. I'm speaking to you from Hampton, New Brunswick, where it is a beautiful sunny day. And have been part of the hub since really very early days, and it's been a delight to work with this team. I've learned a lot, and we're still getting going. And it's nice to see some familiar names on this chat. Diane, I see your hi coming in, and I hope you're doing well. And my goal for today is really to give you an intro, right? I know some of you are already applying DE. It may be very familiar to some. It may be brand new to others. But let's really sort of start to dive into what is this thing called developmental evaluation. At the end, I'm going to point to some other resources. If this has piqued your curiosity, that you can then go on and pursue some other things, and we may talk about some other follow-up activity. And along the way, I'd really encourage folks to put questions in chat. I'll try and address those as best as we can through the call or through the webinar. And if not, in this session, we'll try and have a follow-up way where we can get to the ones that we didn't get to today. I'd like to start by just saying, developmental evaluation, there's no set method, there's no set approach. You're not going to come out of this with the 10 things. If you do A, B, C, D, E, etc., you will do DE. It is really a distinction in purpose. And we're going to talk a lot about, as Barb said, complexity. We're going to talk about innovation. And really, we're talking about evaluation. And evaluation is really about being systematic, using evidence, being thorough, thinking critically, and applying it to these situations of complexity and innovation. So we can go to the next slide. I want to start with some of the features of a classic evaluation. And so one of the things we know is that when the problem is really well understood, when there's really clear boundaries, when we know that there is probably an optimal solution or a limited set of possible solutions, we can apply a lot of logic to that. And evaluation was really built around that kind of problem solving, right? Judgments about the merit or worth of a very standardized program, helping things to be implemented with more efficiency, refining in pursuit of a really dependable model. And so in evaluation, we saw a lot of clear, specific, measurable outcomes that you know right from the outset, controlled experiments, being able to explain, predict, and control. This whole idea that cause and effect are in fact repeatable, perceivable, and predictable. And that's extremely helpful. And a lot of evaluation is still geared towards doing that. And if that is the circumstance you are in, absolutely, very classic approaches to evaluation still make a lot of sense. But there's a big challenge. And if we go to the next slide, that challenge is we're confronted with more and more complex problems, or wicked problems, as sometimes we refer to these as. And these really bring us to the frontier of our competence, our experience, our knowledge. They're characterized by uncertainty, interdependence. And so when we're operating in a complex system, it's really difficult to understand the ramifications of any changes. It's really difficult to predict outcomes in advance. It's really difficult to even know exactly what outcome we want to have, because we're figuring that out. A solution may appear initially ideal, but what you learn through the experience of doing it needs to be recrafted, because maybe a critical stakeholder or definition was excluded, and it needs to be reworked in a way that they can be included. We understand more about the context we're operating in as we start to do things. We understand that new ideas and new learnings may emerge that might be incorporated into the design. And so the design, the strategy are ever evolving as we try and work our way through these complex problems. And what we're really trying to do with developmental evaluation is bring that rigor of thought, of drawing evidence, but apply it to this kind of complexity. And so here, yes, there is a cause and effect, but we can only make sense of it in retrospect. And it may not repeat itself because we have all these interdependent factors and features. They may recombine in a new way the next time. And so we have to be equipped to have the feedback to understand and look at that as we go forward. Which brings me to the next feature of what really underlies developmental evaluation, and that is innovation. We can go to our next slide. And this is where I think probably a lot of you find your work at this time is you're trying to come up with creative, novel responses to perhaps persistent challenges or unique and new challenges. But we're really coming at things in a new way. And so within that, there's a lot of exploration, there's a lot of experimentation. We may have new ways of understanding, defining, or articulating a particular problem. And you know, it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We may be drawing a lot on practice, on what we know how to do, but maybe we're recombining things in a new way, or we're building in a new feature, or we're adjusting. And there's various scales of innovation. Sometimes an innovation is very sort of minor, and sometimes it's a complete rethink of a business model or a conceptual model that underlies what we're doing. But I think what we're really trying to do is do something in an applied way, and over time do it in a way that it achieves some kind of scale, that we grow it to have greater impact and effect. And so if we go to the next slide, the challenge of traditional evaluation, and it was really born out of the frustration a lot of social innovators were having as they tried to tackle wicked problems, is that upfront definition, clarity, measuring progress on preset steps was actually really unhelpful to the process of responding to complexity and doing the work of serious innovation. And so what we try to do in the developmental evaluation is to do and learn and then adjust, as opposed to in something that's much more of a simple situation where we might come in with an understanding, a plan, and apply that plan and monitor the extent to which we're following that plan. Here we're actually doing as part of the act of learning. That learning gives us feedback. And so evaluation makes some trade-offs between rigor. It's not about being not rigorous. It's absolutely about being rigorous. But we make trade-offs because it's actually really helpful to have that feedback sooner than later. If we get too far down the road and not access the learning, we may have not taken the path that we should be taken based on what we're learning from that sort of thing. The evaluator is really interactive in a way that really helps the innovator to develop what they're working on, consider and adapt to the uncertainties they're facing with, and inform their decisions. So there's a really tight link between developmental evaluation and strategy making. And I would say what we're really trying to do as developmental evaluators is facilitate an assessment of where we're at, how are things unfolding, what directions hold promise, what ones should be abandoned, what new experiments should be tried, and take the next step and repeat and repeat and repeat. So we're really learning our way through a process of discovery that helps us get to a place of, you know, here's what we are trying to do. We understand that better over time, and here's how we are moving towards that thing that we are trying to do. One of the things I think we often see is over time, the framing of the issue or the problem or the challenge or the thing that we're working on shifts, or the context we're working on has shifted. Maybe some of you have faced a pretty major contextual shift over the last few months. I'm guessing all have in a pretty significant way. And all of that shapes the kind of responses we want to bring to that. And so one of the things we really watch for is not only what we are doing, but even how we are thinking about what we are doing. Key concepts, keywords, key underlying ideas? How are they being conceptualized, articulated? Do we have a shared understanding about those sorts of things? So again, a reminder, please fire away if there are questions or comments. Welcome those in the chat, and we'll try and address those as best as we can. But I'm just going to keep on rolling along. And so one of the things I want to introduce to you now is like, so when would I use that? And over time, the practice of DE has really evolved into having a handful of situations which seem to be really appropriate for a developmental evaluation. And so if we go to the next slide, I want to speak to each of these. And what I'm going to start to do is introduce an example of a group I worked with many years ago who applied developmental evaluation. And I think that might be a way to start to wrap our head around, well, how do some of these things actually play out on the ground? And so when would I use DE is really a version of these 5 general themes. And these aren't cut and dry. Often we might find ourselves in a situation that is resonant with 1 or more or 2 or more of these sorts of things. But we often see people looking to DE when they know they're going to be continually adapting and refining an idea or initiative or an initiative. And actually the very, very first case ever of developmental evaluation was a leadership program in Minnesota. And the evaluator working on that was confronted with what was to be a very standardized kind of formative evaluation for a couple of years, and then really lock down the program and do a summative assessment to prove it works over the next couple of years. And the folks running that program were saying, we can't lock this program down because the economics of the region we're serving are changing significantly. The demographics of who we're serving are always changing. We need to keep refining and changing this program. And so what was born out of that was developmental evaluation. The idea that we will continually be assessing how we're doing, what we're doing, and what we are learning, and applying that to the ongoing assessment and refinement of this program. Another application, though, is sometimes we've got some really good principles from elsewhere, and we want to bring those into our context because we know that there's certain features, characteristics of an idea or of a model that will need to change to fit our local situation. And so we see a lot of developmental evaluation applied to say, okay, well, how are these principles playing out in our situation? How do they need to be adapted further? Which of them are particularly relevant and maybe we can stay true to, and which do we need to be changing and modifying and adjusting around? The third is in response to a crisis. And we're seeing a lot of that right now in response to the pandemic. A lot of organizations are completely rethinking approaches. And we're getting lots of stories and examples of organizations applying developmental evaluation as a way of thinking through and learning through the kind of strategy, direction, adjustments that they're making in response to the current situation. A fourth is really about that scale aspiration. And so sometimes we have an early idea that we're just creating from scratch, but the intent over time is actually to build that into something that is much more stable and structured. And so here we can see a developmental evaluation being part of the early period, and that period could be months, it could be a year, it could be several years, which is really about the formation of and the prototyping of and creation of that idea from scratch. But then at some point, you probably switch to a pilot to say, we've actually figured most of it out. And we're going to pilot it with a lot of structure and a lot of certainty now. And over time, you actually may get to, here's actually a replicable model that can be shared. We understand, we are no longer at the frontier of our knowledge and understanding. We've actually structured something that's pretty solid and can be repeated with a lot of confidence, right? And so you really move at the front end from developmental evaluation into more traditional kinds of evaluation. And then lastly, this idea of working across scale. So sometimes we have seen a lot of success in maybe a program or initiative, and now we want to move that idea or that initiative or that intervention into, let's say, the policy realm, or around larger cultural shifts, or at a regional level, that introduces new uncertainties, new complexities, new disagreements to be sorted through. And so having developmental evaluation as a way of understanding what that transition and that sort of liminal moment of moving from one stage to another looks like, and what, again, what we hold on to and what we shift through those kind of transitions can be really, really helpful. The example I want to speak to is with the United Way Toronto. I think now United Way Toronto and York region, I think is at the time they were just the United Way of Toronto when I was working with them. We did a developmental evaluation on an educational attainment youth program and the creation of a community of practice in Toronto to support youth serving organizations and to really share practice, learn from one another in trying to improve educational attainment for young people. And the observation at that time for the United Way was that a lot of the organizations, particularly frontline, were quite isolated with one another. A lot of practical lessons and insights on the ground were being generated, but they weren't necessarily moving through the system and being shared from organization to organization. There was lots of good evidence coming out about practice, but that wasn't necessarily, again, reaching as strongly into organizations. And it was actually very hard for a lot of frontline workers to access capacity building because of the nature of their work. And so the United Way had a special sort of a philanthropic grant, a donor really helped them do this program. It was a major shift in funding model for them. And DE really helped them, adapt some principles from elsewhere. So that's one of the 5 niches, right? There's a lot of work out there about communities of practice, but this was really applying a community of practice that was driven by a large central organization. And that there was a knowledge that this community of practice would no doubt be adapting in an ongoing way as it was implemented. And so the developmental evaluation there really served the startup and first several years, I would say 4 years of pretty heavy duty learning as this thing took shape. And the core group that this evaluation served was the innovation team. And so developmental evaluation really primarily is for the people who are doing the design, the strategy, the work on the ground. And so there was a staff team of 3 people, and one of the senior manager was very, very closely engaged, in and out a little bit more. But that group of 4 were the primary audience of this developmental evaluation. And the evaluation gathered feedback on a range of things that helped them think through their decisions in the development and really creation of this initiative. So could we jump to the next slide? And so developmental evaluation really is a distinction in purpose, as I mentioned before, right? It's really about using what's great about evaluation, critical thinking, research, approaches, evidence, and applying that to this complexity. I think that really requires that as evaluators, we bring in data and help facilitate that sense making that's really, really key for those that are working in often pretty intense ways on the ground about an initiative that they're working on, and give them insight into the dynamics that they're seeing and how they might then shift their innovations in response to what's happening on the ground, right? New things are learned, the framing of the issue shifts, partners change, the politics change, the context change. All of this shapes the novelty of the approach that we're trying to bring and even how we think about the problem, as I mentioned before. And so with our United Way example, they had a pretty good understanding of communities of practice, but weren't really sure how to apply it in this situation. But rather than plan, they really just started. They knew a lot about the various players in their community, but didn't really know what their collective need would be. Who would show up? Where would this lead? And so the evaluation out of the gate was really taking stock a lot about who is coming, what kind of interactions are starting to emerge amongst them, what are people looking for, how are they responding to what we are offering, what do they tend to like and not like, both in terms of process and in terms of content, and let that shape the next step. And so lots of very kind of iterative learning by just trying some stuff out, but then building in time to make sure we capture some data, capture some perspective in real time, and then look at that as a team, as a core team trying to sort through what should we do next. They were quite disciplined in building time to think about what we're learning relative to this new data. The other feature of this example, though, was that I think the evaluation was helpful to them in communicating to a group of stakeholders in orbit around the initiative who were taking risks, who were invested in it, who had a stake in it. So the board, senior management of the organization, and the major donor who contributed to this. This was a new way of operating, was pretty risky for them. And so the evaluation kept them appraised of what was being tried, what was being learned, and where it was all going. And I think this provided kind of an accountability for learning. It wasn't accountability for outcome. Everyone knew and had bought into that this isn't going to deliver X in a very short period of time. But what the accountability was that people were readying for was, we need to understand that this thing is evolving, moving forward, and is getting better over time. And the evaluation provided a bit of a narrative account that could then be communicated to those stakeholders. So I see, I'm going to go to the next slide in a moment, but I've got a question here from Diane about the relationship between developmental evaluation and principles-focused evaluation. And I think they're two, if you imagine sort of two somewhat overlapping, but not completely overlapping circles, Diane. That there are DE, developmental evaluation, can be guided by principles. There are 8 DE principles, which are really helpful for DE practitioners in thinking about their practice and the work that they're doing. And so I probably won't get all 8 off the top of my head, but they're a complexity. So at serving a developmental purpose, the purpose is to develop complexity, systems orientation, giving timely feedback, co-creating with those that are doing the evaluation, drawing upon evaluation rigor. So that's at 6. Utilization, making sure that it serves those that the evaluation is supposed to be used by. And there's another one that I'm not going to get to off the top of my head. So DE, like many practices, can be guided by principles. That said, you may be doing a developmental evaluation in an area where there are either principles of effectiveness or principles as kind of value statements. And I think principles-focused evaluation speaks to both of those. And so if we're talking about principles as values, let's say equity is a really essential value of an initiative. A DE could look at that principle and say, to what extent is equity playing out in the early stages of our initiative? What are we learning about applying that principle in that context? To what extent are we actually walking the talk of that principle in the work we are doing? Is it rhetoric, or is it actually something actionable on the ground? So it could be a line of inquiry within the DE. I think the principles of effectiveness are what may be produced out of a DE over time. We may get to a place where one of the things we learn about the complex system we're operating in, that these are principles of what it means to be effective in this area. And the DE may be helpful to terms of understanding and articulating those. So, you know, fire in a chat, Diane, if you have a follow-up to that, and we can circle back to it. Can we jump to our next slide, which is who does developmental evaluation? And really, I think this is a recap of a lot of what we've been talking about. And so, you know, I won't read the slide to you. Actually, I will, because I think we have a lot of people on the phone. So it's about those who want a different solution to a persistent problem. It's for those who value rapid real-time feedback and have a high tolerance for ambiguity, embrace uncertainty, learn quickly, and adapt rapidly to change conditions. It's for those who are propelled into action by more than vision, but then by clear, specific, measurable outcomes. They're not always sure how to get where they're heading, so tend to be constrained by too much upfront specificity. For example, preset activities, outcomes, or target. Those who know that disrupting systems lead to unexpected actions and reactions. And ultimately, those who want an evaluation approach attuned to changing conditions and their adaptive approach. They're at home in complex dynamic systems. Such systems characterize the world in which they live and work. Thus, they want an evaluation approach attuned to that complexity. And so I think a basic principle of evaluation is like, for whom to do what? Who's the user? What are they using it for? And we talked about two users in that community of practice example, the core team. But that use there was really about design and strategy decisions. And the other use, as I mentioned, was that senior management group and major donor and the board. And there the use was really about accountability in order to really, I think, buy and hold the space for exploration as they engaged in something that was a little more risky. So I'm going to pause and we're going to do a little poll. That was really the intro to what DE is. And then when we come back after the poll, I'm going to highlight a couple areas where we might be able to apply it.
Okay, so I'll pick up that poll there, Jamie, thank you. And this first poll question, based on that kind of lovely overview from Jamie about developmental evaluation, just asks, to what extent do you see a fit between your initiative and developmental evaluation, or DE? Et en français, à quel point est-ce que vous voyez un lien entre votre initiative et l'évaluation évolutive? So for those of you who are who can see the poll and are able, please enter your responses in, and we'll take a look at the results in just a moment. Okay, we'll just give another 20 seconds or so. Actually, I think the responses are kind of slowing in, so I will end the poll and share the results. So thanks for entering your responses in. Here are the results, again, for those of you who are able to see them on your computer. But it looks like about half, just over half, agree that they completely see the fit, and another 36% moderately, and just a 9% slightly fit between their initiative and DE. So thanks for that. And I will pass it back over to Jamie. Let me know if you want me to leave those poll results up at all, Jamie.
Yeah, okay, I think we got a good snapshot of that. So thank you, appreciate that. If we can jump to the next slide. So yeah, over half saying completely, and then another strong bunch saying, you know, yeah, it works for me. So let's just leave you with a few ideas around where you can maybe start to apply this. And then we'll leave some time at the back end for questions. So the first thing I want to highlight is, well, I'm going to go through these 4 ones. You see them on the screen in front of you. Let's go right to the next slide, which is about prototyping. And prototyping is distinct from piloting. So prototyping is very much about building a version of an idea, trying it out, and getting rapid feedback, learning by doing. Where a pilot is really about testing and validating and implementing something that's pretty fully baked. And so developmental evaluation draws a lot on prototyping as being sort of quick experiments where we can build successive prototypes in order to learn more about the challenge being addressed or promising solutions that deserve further investment. It should be inexpensive, it should be quick, it should encourage experimentation, and it should be learning rich. So an example from that community of practice initiative that I was speaking to is in their early gatherings, they would do some A/B testing. So they would very purposefully do 2 different processes and then ask people through maybe a sticky note poll or just some comments, you know, low tech, quick, which they preferred and why. And the idea here was let's actually put forward all the ideas we have in a way, but learn from the response of people, and then bring that into or abandon in the next iteration of the gatherings that they were hosting. 3 screens that might be useful for you in thinking about assessing a prototype are the questions of desirability. Do people like it? Feasibility, like, do we know how to do it? Are we technically able to pull it off? And then viability, you know, is there a business case for doing this? Do we have the capacity and resources to pull it off? Go to the next slide. Another thing you can do is start to think about your theory of change. And so this is sort of one classic version of sort of the logic that might underlie a theory of change. And if you've got a really well-defined, clearly understood, widely shared theory of change, you're probably not in a developmental situation. If yours looks more like this, if we can go to the next slide, you probably are, right? So for innovations in complex systems, a theory of change shouldn't be fully fleshed out at the start, right? If it's actually an innovation, you should be saying, we have some initial hypotheses about where to start. We have a sense of what our end game should be, but we don't know how it's going to unfold till we get in the field and see how people respond to it. It's a very different kind of situation, and different and challenging for evaluators who are used to upfront trying to define and nail down a theory of change. But I think a place to really start is start to say, okay, what do we know? Where is there clarity? Where is there uncertainty? What are some options and alternatives? Like, do we have a version A and a version B of our theory of change? Can we, over time, by using developmental evaluation, move from something that's implicit and undocumented to something that is more explicit and documented? Can we move from something that's fragmented amongst our stakeholder group and the theories that they might have into one that's maybe more widely held and has a shared understanding? Can we move from something that's not too plausible or testable to something that's increasingly doable and testable? So as an example, the community of practice example I shared, over 3 years, had 9 versions of their theory of change, right? And they kind of wore that as a badge of honor over time, that they were learning, refining, and re-articulating what it was they were doing and how it was they were doing it. And so I think that this is a really good place in terms of starting. The next slide is about framing key concepts. And what we find is that early on, we use code words, we use keywords, we use key concepts, and we probably have different understandings of what those mean. And so a good way of getting started with a developmental evaluation is starting to probe or explore with your stakeholder groups, even within your own team, what do we mean when we say some of the things that are particularly relevant to what we are working on? If we say social innovation, do we actually all have the same understanding of that? If we talk about readiness, do we all have the same understanding of that? If we talk about mental health promotion, do we all have the same understanding of that? And the point is not to force a definition, but just to explore the diversity of understanding so that you can move forward then with strategies in a way that allows you to have a more constructive conversation. So that's a useful way to start to explore that. And then lastly, the next slide here is to build in some kind of sense-making practice. Sometimes people call these after-action reviews. Sometimes we call them sense-making sessions. They can become a part of standing existing meetings that you may be doing. You may carve out a special time to do it. The community of practice I spoke to, we spent between a half a day and 1 day, once a quarter, looking at a series of questions and revisiting those questions the next time and building on or refining, adding to them. But really, it boils down to these questions: what, so what, and now what? And if we go to our next slide, these are very much around what are we developing? Like, be descriptive. What's going on here? What's occurring? What's not occurring? But the so what is trying to make meaning of that. So what does that mean for us? Is this what we expected? Were we surprised by that? What are we learning about what's going on? What are some of the patterns that we're seeing across multiple things? And then the now, what does this mean for our strategy? What does this mean in terms of the implications of what we are doing next? What does what we have learned inform for us in terms of the next set of activities that we want to do? And so next slide. So I moved very quickly through those 4 examples. I just want to make sure that we do have time for some questions at the end. And I know we do have a few more polls that we want to do with you. So I'm going to point to 4 resources. One is a primer that I wrote for the McConnell Foundation in 2008. And actually a second edition is in development right now and will be out at some point, hopefully this fall. There's a great article by Haley Preskel and Tanya Beer on DE called Evaluating Social Innovation. BetterEvaluation.org has tons of great resources, but they have a whole DE page, and that will take you into other resources. And if you are interested in case examples, this is a book you need to buy, but Michael Quinpat and Kate McCaig and Nan Wapanea have edited a book on case examples called Developmental Evaluation Exemplars. And so that's out there for you. And Eric, yes, the primer is available in French too. You can download both of those from the McConnell Foundation website. And I think other places are hosting it now as well. So I'm going to pause there and really move to a Q&A time. We've got a few minutes to do that. So welcome those in the chat, or if people on the phone want to ask their question verbally, or even people on video want to ask their question over video, then absolutely we can do that too. So first question: how to approach research ethics doing a DE approach? It's a big question. Lots of people are thinking about it, writing about it, worrying about it. I think some ethics boards are understanding and starting to sort of adjust approaches related to that. I think some are not. But I think there is a need around really articulating what does ethics look like in that. I can put in, well, I'm not going to try and find it and put it in the chat because that'll get clunky, but we'll send out, there's a blog series I wrote with 2 colleagues from New Zealand, Penny Hagen and Kate McCaig, and one of our postings did get at research ethics. So Marla, I'll make sure you get that, and we'll send that out to everybody so you could read more about that. It's there for sure.
Le français, les sciences, mais ici à Yellowknife, dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest, il y a aussi le Déné-Kédé, les peuples Déné. Coloniser l'école en espérant et aussi au nom.
I know there was a question. I didn't quite get it.
I think that just sounded like unrelated audio.
Okay.
Could be wrong though.
Any other questions? So there's a question, but it might be more for Barb.
No problem. I think, you know, I'm actually not surprised, and I'm actually heartened by the questions that are coming up here about the submissions to research ethics boards. And it is something that the Hub can provide some support for. And I think really important, and this is off the top, but it's something we are absolutely thinking about right now and actually working with one project more directly on this. But I think, as we all know, it's the, you know, the engagement with human subjects. I even hate to use that word, subjects, but that's sort of the essence of when ethics are required, and if you want to be able to publish your results more formally, etc. And I think that, I mean, right now, there are, Jamie, as you were mentioning, there are guidelines about, you know, how to incorporate DE into ethics applications. And there's an educational process of what that looks like for, you know, ethics boards as well. But I think that another important point to make is that when you're dealing with conditions under which ethics approval is required, that is more of a gray zone than it is a, you know, a black and white situation. And so navigating when and how and under what conditions, that's absolutely something that the Hub can work with, not just individual projects, but we're actually putting together a tool right now that distills some of the guidance from reputable sources and tools, and our own experience, quite frankly, in navigating a lot of gray zones within a university environment. And in tandem with that, working with the public health agency to ensure that, I mean, the guidance and the requirements are completely in sync. And it's really a question of for what and when the ethics approval is going to be needed. And so that's absolutely something that we can help navigate.
Thanks, Barb. It's great. So everyone, and we'll send this out again after. So don't, you know, if you don't want to get it right now, but in the chat is the link to the blog series. It was hosted by the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, and came following a week I spent there working with them in 2018. But the evidence for innovation posting is the one that I think speaks to some of the ethics board stuff that's been coming up. Any other questions, chat-wise or speaking-wise? So maybe Eric, do you want to, looks like we're good to turn it back to you to do some polling.
Sure, yeah. Just a second poll here. And of course, feel free to add questions and still to the chat. We can approach them afterwards, but I will throw up this poll right now, which is on top of or other than those resources that Jamie had linked, what other resources and supports on developmental evaluation might be of most interest to you? So here are just a couple examples. So please feel free to select multiple if you can or if you want. Et en français, quelles d'autres ressources et soutiens sur l'évaluation évolutive vous intéresseraient le plus?
And maybe Eric, read out the options.
Sure, yeah, I will also read out the options. There are a handful. So the first is a blog post with relevant DE insights and resources. Annotated DE resources, as you would find them on the resource page on our website. An online forum to share DE ideas and experiences with others. A DE interest group, including virtual meetings periodically with input from a DE specialist. Mentoring on DE from a DE specialist. Any others that you can think of, please feel free to select that option if you like and enter in anything into the chat. And we'll take a look at that accordingly. And a final response option is just that additional resources and supports on DE are not of interest to me. So we'll give a little bit more time on this one, just because there's a few, little bit more text to it.
And to give everyone a little bit of context for this, as you're thinking about those, is one of the ways the hub is envisioning and developing some of the supports is about sort of a suite of activities around, because there's no one size fits all, and it's, you know, sort of relevant and timely for each project. And so sort of a suite of supports on particularly relevant topics. And so that's why we're putting forth just some very tangible sort of options that we can actually act on, and that form that, you know, sort of that a set of complementary support. So this question really does have some relevance for choices of things that we can put together as well.
Just a few more seconds here and I'll share the results. I just about have the same number of votes as the first poll. So that's probably pretty much everyone.
Maybe while you're waiting, Eric, there was just a comment about third-party evaluation working with local university and prof. It's very, fit is very tough. Like, I think DE, you know, doesn't necessarily, I mean, I think having methodological expertise certainly is important and helps. But it's not a fit for everyone, and you know, sometimes looking outside of researchers and evaluators is actually a good strategy, or working in partnership, like an additional person who maybe leads the DE and then draws upon those academic resources around answering a specific question. I've seen that work really well. Anyway, and hopefully some of the resources that I pointed to you will give you some insight into those, and with some of this follow-up activity that we're talking about, that's something that we could help return to, is who's best to do it and how to kind of construct that relationship.
Awesome. So just a quick overview of the results from that particular poll. Looks like quite a bit of interest in a blog post, in annotated DE resources, some more moderate interest in an online forum, mentoring from a DE specialist, and some interest as well in a DE interest group. And thanks again for submitting your responses.
Jamie, there's another question in the chat about whether you can mix developmental evaluation with an impact evaluation.
Yeah, so I absolutely. I think there's a bit of a myth out there that DE is like a process evaluation. Like we from the outset, we're doing things to have an impact. And so I think right out of the gate, a DE should be paying attention to understanding, what do we think our intended impact is, could be, should be, and how are we making early signs of progress towards that impact. And so that can be very much embedded within a line of inquiry within DE. My hunch is you're talking about more like sort of assessing the ultimate impact. And I think in time, you know, a lot of evaluations are patch evaluations. They're a bit of DE, they're a bit of summative at a later time. Maybe there's some accountability and sort of auditing things that are thrown in there because that's a need for somebody. And so I think that sort of ultimate impact, you probably don't want to have it too heavy too early, because it can actually get in the way of the innovation process. But at some point, you do need to make some kind of summative assessment about, yeah, we kind of had the effect we were hoping to have, or we're on the right track to that, or we should continue to invest in what we are doing. So I think they absolutely do coexist.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm going to wrap things up with a few closing comments. I want to be respectful of people's time here. I think that last question is really, really important, in that a key point being that developmental evaluation can be relevant throughout all stages of an innovation. And when it comes to impact evaluation, part of the DE inquiry, in fact, could be sort of that what's firm, what's flexible, as it relates to, I'm sure we've all probably heard of the assessment of fidelity. So how true do we stay to an innovation? And so there are certain questions that are more that process of inquiry that can be relevant at all stages of the innovation, and linked to different types of evaluation as well. Jamie, you comfortable enough with that answer?
Awesome. Nailed it.
All right. So I think Jamie, you've really, I think very difficult to do in a short period of time is provide that sort of overview. This group on the call, I think you're a very unique group in that sort of you're savvy with innovation, you're savvy with and comfort with uncertainty. That's a very different, it's a very small or a very unique subset of the population. And so when Jamie says something like there's no recipe, people don't go, oh, shoot, that's exactly what I was looking for. But that doesn't mean that it's just this nebulous mess. I think that Jenny, I was really heartened by your comment in the chat about, oh, awesome slide. It was the slide on the sense making, the what, so what, now what. I think that revealed sort of that process of inquiry that does have methodology attached to it, and yet is perhaps a different type of methodology than what people might typically think of about that outcome tool that's pulled off the shelf type of thing. So I think that, I kind of sense that nobody kind of ran away from the idea of there's no recipe. And so I think that part of what we as a community, and I mean the hub, I mean the project, I mean the public health agency, providing leadership for this whole innovation fund, I think one of our collective jobs is to actually make visible and legitimize conditions of uncertainty and what that means for how we operate. So, I think we all know if we do the same we've always done, we'll get the same results. That's not what we're looking for within the Mental Health Promotion Innovation Fund. And so we just need to make that more visible about the systematic thinking and processes that are indeed part of innovation and of adaptations. And I think, Jamie, you've just done a terrific job in being able to weave that narrative into, the whole tradition of developmental evaluation. So thanks very much for that. And we don't have time for lots of reactions, but, feel free, everyone, to, do your little hand clapping for those on video. No, sincere thanks, and sincere thanks to everybody for literally, I use this phrase at the beginning, showing up for today's call. So I think what we'd like to do is just conclude with one final poll, and Eric will walk us through that.
For sure. So yeah, one quick final concluding poll. Simply for those of you who are able, how useful was today's webinar for you? Est-ce que le webinaire aujourd'hui vous a été utile? I appreciate all the responses coming in so quickly. I will bring this down and show you the results. And thanks again for your participation in these polls. They really do give us a good snapshot of what you guys are all feeling.
Yeah. And that honest, authentic feedback is really, really important.
Absolutely.
And is not always just a moment in time. It can certainly follow as well. So the follow-up from this webinar from a hub perspective will be the usual, an event brief, and that will be both recorded and also in writing. And we will also consider your feedback and on what other complementary supports might be useful, and we'll be acting on those, and probably, as appropriate, just working with you to shape those a little bit more. But it seems as though there's quite a bit of interest in this, and so we will absolutely be following up on those suggestions. Thank you again, everybody, and best wishes for the rest of the day and continuing on in these uncertain conditions.
Thank you, everyone. Great to be with you.
Hi, everybody.